Hey everybody, here are a couple more examples of completing the square if I lost you in class, or if you are having trouble with Math Excel and you just need a little bit of a refresher as far as the completing the square problems go. So you can refer to your notes for the 6 steps that we have that you follow when you're doing completing the square. But I'll go ahead and get started on this very first one. This is the first problem for Math Excel. Again, you're going to have different numbers probably, but it's the same type of problem. So step 1 is to move the 4 over to the other side. So when you move it over, it becomes positive, so don't make a silly mistake with positives and negatives just on the very first step. It's going to screw up the whole problem. Step 2, factor out the lead coefficient, and this lead coefficient is 1, so we're good on that. So we don't need to factor anything out, but keep in mind the next example we're going to do, you will have to factor something out. Step 3 is to add the blanks into each side. 4 plus blank. And now we have to actually complete the square. So remember, you take half of this negative 18, which is negative 9, and keep the sign with it. But when you square it, it does become positive. So we put 81 in the blank on each side. From this step, what we're going to do is we're going to factor the left-hand side, and the whole purpose of adding that 81 to both sides is to allow this left-hand side to factor into a perfect square trinomial. And remember, you just use this number if you're not as good at factoring. It's always going to be that number if you write it down. That's where you look to figure out how this thing's going to factor. It's x minus 9 squared. And then just combine like terms on the right and you get 85. Okay, from here we're just going to finish the problem with square root property. So you're going to square root both sides. And be very careful not to forget your plus or minus. Plus or minus radical 85. Quick check to make sure that radical 85 doesn't break down, because you would need to break down that radical if it did. But in this example it does not. So our final answer, the way you're going to write it, you just have to add 9 to both sides. So we have positive 9 plus or minus radical 85. Remember, in Math Excel, there's no plus or minus button, so you would type into the box x equals 9 plus radical 85, comma, 9 minus radical 85. Okay? That is example number 1. Let's go to example number 2, which is a little bit harder. Very first thing I notice is that I've got a negative coefficient here, which isn't too big of a deal. You will want to factor that out when you're doing, when you're getting into your completing the square, but another easy thing to do would be to multiply every single thing in the equation by negative 1, just to get rid of that negative sign. So that's going to give us an equation of 4x squared plus 8x, minus 8x. Equals negative 11. So the next thing we're going to do, remember step 2 on our list of steps in our notes is to factor out the 4. So we're going to factor out the 4 from this left-hand side now, which makes it minus 2x. And I'll put in my blanks at the same time, negative 11 plus blank. Okay? So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to take half of this number, this b term, this negative 2. Half of negative 2 is negative 1. And then when you square it, you get positive 1. But then the thing that you have to remember, and the weird part about these problems, is that in order to keep the equation balanced, what ends up going in this side over here is the 1 times the 4, because the 4 is being distributed to that 1. So that's where we're going to get a 4 over here when we complete the square on the right. Okay. So now we just have to factor. So I'm going to keep the 4 here, and I'm going to factor this, and it always uses this sign here. It's this binomial or trinomial that we're factoring here. And it's always going to factor into something squared. And it's always going to be that x minus 1. Always this number. Okay? Equals, and then negative 11 plus 4 is negative 7. So now before I square root both sides, remember you want to divide both sides by the 4 to cancel that, so that we have only the quantity squared left over on the left. And then we have x minus 1 squared equals negative 7 over 4. Okay, now from here, we're going to square root both sides. So I get just x minus 1 on the left equals, and then I have the square root of negative 7 over the square root of 4. You can square root the individually for the fractions. So then I end up with, I'm going to go up here to finish the problem, x minus 1 equals I radical 7 with a plus or minus over 2. Because the square root of 4 is 2, so now I just have to add 1 to both sides. So I have x equals positive 1 plus or minus I radical 7 over 2. And that's our final answer. So the examples that we did in class today had some fractions in them, and those are a little bit more challenging, but this should hopefully give you just another refresher of the step-by-step process you have to take for completing the square. Come on in and see me if you have any questions, okay? Good luck!